new intelligent report from that guy who leaked all the documents on Discord reveals that the CIA and Europe knew about the plot to blow up the Nordstream pipeline 3 months before it happened. Uniquely, Biden also mentioned that he knew that we would be able to stop that thing if we needed to as well, like a year ago. So, yeah, I mean, what does this say about the Ukraine situation if Ukraine, the country that we're providing billions and billions of dollars for, very well may have, or at least players in the Ukrainian military very well may have been involved with blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, which is an act of terrorism, a huge environmental disaster, maybe the biggest man-made environmental disaster ever, I believe I read.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the first point about this is obviously, if these reports are true, of course,
Right.
there's no way that Ukraine would have done this without not just our knowledge, but tacit approval from the U.S. Like, otherwise, this would have been a firestorm, and we would have been extremely upset with them. And they wouldn't have done this without approval from the U.S. And I also think it just like it shows how so much of like warfare and making war really affects citizens so much more than it affects like the policymakers. I hesitate to call them that, but people who are spurring the war on. I mean, this is like obviously like an environmental disaster, but it's also just sort of like economic terrorism. I mean, the effects of this sabotage were like mostly carried by normal like working Europeans who had this like seriously um, force the prices of oil to skyrocket. This is like it's something that people were feeling sort of day to day in their pocketbooks, and something
Yeah,
that had no
the
real consequences.
the immediate
Policymakers.
material issue for people was a whole bunch of Germans had to go through a cold winter and they didn't have the natural gas they needed to heat their homes, or yeah, I think that was it. So like
Yeah, yeah,
actual people were being put at serious risk because of this financial, economic move that the U.S. made, which is essentially what it was.
yeah. And I think it just shows like so it's as always in war, like citizens are so much more impacted, but also like just the precarity of the situation we're in. This is like if you believe the Ukrainian narrative and it's a Russian act of terrorism, there's also there sort of downstream implications for that too. And the more that war bleeds out into the civilian sphere, and especially like beyond the borders of Ukraine, the more of a chance there is for something to go wrong that triggers a much larger catastrophe. And I think that is the risk we run as the war goes on longer and longer and longer, is that everything is on a knife's edge right now. And we're talking about, Russia's a nuclear power. Ukraine has tons of material from us. NATO has nukes at their disposal too, obviously.
Mhm.
And the longer the war goes on, the more of a chance there is that something is going to tip over the line, whether it's sort of like, the effects from a pretty like weird plan like this. I mean, sort of an out of left field sabotage plan like this, or something more prosaic, like someone, accidentally shells like a residential area of
Yep.
Poland or something like that. Which has already happened a bit, but if 50 people die or 100 people die, it's a very different order of magnitude of crisis. And it's just, this is the risk of an ongoing land war in such a dense area, such a, from a population density perspective, dense area of the globe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's bad news, and when none of the parties are really pushing for peace, when the U.S. is sending billions and billions of dollars, writing blank checks for weapons over there, and Blinken just this week made very clear that calls for a ceasefire that the U.S. does not support and will not support, despite China and Lula da Silva in Brazil trying hard for a peace process, trying for a ceasefire and negotiations. The U.S. is not going to engage in that, which means what? Which means that we're going to be fighting till all the Ukrainians are dead, or all the Russians are dead, or Putin just gives up. I don't think Putin is going to give up. I don't think he's going to admit he made a terrible, terrible mistake, which he did do. He's not going to do that. And they're a nuclear power. And so, worst comes to worst, if we back a nuclear power into the corner enough, well, eventually they're either going to use nukes or they're just going to give up completely and say, we've built all these weapons for nothing and we had never had any intention of using them. And I don't think that's the case.
Yeah,
So,
sadly, I mean, there seems like, from Russia's perspective, from Putin's perspective, there's no limit to like the amount of lives lost of,
no.
young Russian men mostly that he won't tolerate. I mean, it just seems like this can go on forever. And for Ukraine, I mean, it's an existential struggle for them. Like they've gauged it correctly in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is no limit for them in that respect too, because it feels like a battle for existential defense. And it just seems like the only way a conflict like this can be resolved is by intervention from the rest of the world's community,
Yeah.
and not just like fueling this ongoing war more and more and more, to really like satisfy political ends on the US's behalf for the most part. This is a political calculus on the part of policymakers, um, and it has a lot to do with the way people in this country and lots of people in the Democratic Party, which historically has been sort of the more dovish party, or should be the more dovish party, but the way the Democratic Party got to thinking about Russia the country during the Trump years because of this constant incessant drumbeat of Putin's puppet and so on. And there's a lot of smoke there. I mean, there were obviously there were relationships between the Trump administration and actors in Russia, but is that justification for letting this, war drag on and on and on, for just continually fueling carnage in Ukraine? I don't think it is. So it's
Right. When
important
you,
for us to be clear-eyed about what's happening.
yeah. And it's important to point out how difficult it is to be clear eyed in a country largely controlled by corporate interests. Who are we supposed to learn the truth from about Ukraine when the news media did not cover the Ukrainian civil war that's been taking place since 2014 after a US backed coup, essentially, in the country? Essentially. Uh, uh, and not to mention today, the news media loves war coverage. They've always loved war coverage. That's what people want to see. That's what makes them money. That's what gives them the advertising dollars. So they don't really have an incentive at all to promote any kind of peace or negotiation talk or dialogue in any way. And meanwhile, all the while, the best thing for weapons manufacturers is an open war supported by the public that they can pour money into, that they can test new technology, uh, and then they just get to watch their stock prices go up. And all the millionaires and billionaires here in the States are making money. And those are the same people funding everything else. So you just have this whole system that is pro war because of the profiteering that comes on the back of it.